It's just before midnight at one of the most heavily guarded prisons in Mexico. The sky above the compound is empty because the government has shut down the entire airspace. The roads outside are blocked. The guards on duty have been ordered to stay silent, stay alert, and follow instructions they still don't fully understand. Then a door opens. A prisoner steps into the cold night air, surrounded by armed officers. His head is lowered, but every guard instantly recognizes him. Joaquín El Chapo Guzmán, the man who slipped out of 2 maximum security prisons. The man whose escapes embarrassed an entire government. The man cartels would risk everything to free. Tonight, he's being moved under a level of secrecy almost no one inside the prison knew about. A plane waits on a dark runway just miles away. American agents stand beside it. Nobody speaks. Nobody moves first. As El Chapo approaches the aircraft stairs, a guard suddenly shouts, loud, sharp, unexpected. Everyone freezes. Weapons rise. Officers step forward. El Chapo stops walking. No one knows if the mission is moments from success or seconds from disaster. El Chapo was never supposed to leave Mexico that night. At least, that's what his lawyers believed. That's what most prison staff believed. And that's what nearly everyone in the country assumed. For months, his legal team fought the United States in court, arguing that extraditing him was unfair and unlawful. They filed challenges. They filed appeals. They told him again and again, "You're not going anywhere anytime soon." But while attorneys battled inside courtrooms, a far more secret conversation was happening somewhere else. A handful of senior Mexican officials had grown increasingly frustrated. They feared El Chapo might escape again. He had already done it twice, once through bribery and once through a tunnel built right beneath his cell. The government couldn't risk a third embarrassment. So they made a decision almost no one knew about. They would extradite him with no warning, no announcement, no chance for anyone to interfere. And the date they chose was January 19th, 2017, the day before a new U.S. president would be sworn in. The world's attention would be fixed on Washington, not on a quiet border prison in Chihuahua. Secrecy became absolute. Only a tiny list of officials were informed. Guards selected for the mission learned about it moments before it started. Phones were confiscated. Instructions were given face-to-face. Routes were changed at the last second. Inside his cell, El Chapo sensed something was wrong. Guards moved with unusual urgency. Doors opened then shut quickly. Officers whispered instead of speaking openly. He had felt this kind of tension before, right before his past escapes. But this time, something was different. 2 guards arrived at his cell. They didn't explain anything. They didn't answer questions. They simply said, "Come with us." El Chapo stood slowly, watching every movement around him. He didn't know where he was going. He didn't know why. And he had no idea that within the hour, he would be surrounded by U.S. Marshals, standing on a dark runway, only seconds away from leaving Mexico forever. The guards led El Chapo down a narrow hallway he had walked many times before, but tonight it felt different. The air was heavier. The silence was deeper. Every footstep echoed like a warning. He noticed something else. The path wasn't the usual route for inmate transfers. They weren't heading toward the administrative wing. They weren't heading toward visitation. They were heading straight toward an exit almost never used. The guards kept a tight formation around him. No one spoke. No one broke stride. As they approached the outer doors, El Chapo looked around carefully. He searched for any sign of where he was going, any sign of what was happening. But everything was too controlled, too precise. When the final steel door opened, the cold night air rushed over him. That's when he saw them. Unmarked vehicles waiting silently outside, engines running but headlights off. This wasn't a routine transfer. This wasn't a simple relocation. Something irreversible was happening. He was guided toward the center vehicle. A guard opened the door, and El Chapo paused for half a second, staring into the darkness inside. It was impossible to see who or what was waiting. A voice from behind quietly said, "Get in." He sat down. The door slammed shut. Immediately, the convoy began to move. No sirens. No lights. Just 3 vehicles rolling through the prison gates with an importance none of the night shift officers understood. Most guards on duty that night didn't even know the prisoner inside was El Chapo. Only a select few were aware. And they had been warned. No radio calls. No stops. No detours. If anything happened, they were to keep driving. Inside the vehicle, El Chapo tried to piece together what was going on. He knew he wasn't being moved to another cell. He knew this wasn't for a court appearance. He knew there were only two possibilities. Either the government was moving him for heightened security, or this was extradition. And if it was extradition, there was nothing he could do to stop it. The convoy sped through back roads around Ciudad Juarez, taking routes purposely chosen to avoid traffic, avoid attention, avoid risk. Every few minutes, the driver received silent hand signals from the lead vehicle. Left turn, slow down, speed up. It was a choreography planned down to the second. Finally, after nearly 20 minutes of rapid, silent movement, the vehicles made a sharp turn and stopped. They had reached their destination, a small, dimly lit runway on the outskirts of the city. And at the end of that runway sat the aircraft waiting to take El Chapo out of Mexico. That's when he understood completely. He wasn't coming back. But before he could take his next breath, something unexpected happened. As the guards opened the door and prepared to escort him out, one of the officers by the gate suddenly started shouting. The entire security team froze. The convoy stopped. And for the second time that night, the mission hung on a knife's edge. The night was already tense, but the sudden shout cut through the air like a blade. Every guard flinched. Every weapon lifted. Every eye turned toward the noise. The officer who yelled was waving his arm urgently, pointing toward the fence line near the edge of the runway. For a moment, no one knew what he had seen. A shadow? A figure? A vehicle? Or something far worse? The head of the Mexican transfer team stepped forward quickly, his voice low but sharp. What did you see? The shouting guard didn't answer right away. He kept staring into the darkness, breathing fast, trying to focus. Everyone waited, frozen in place. El Chapo stood between two officers, still handcuffed, watching silently. His eyes were steady, alert, almost calculating. If something was happening, he wanted to know what it was. And if there was even the smallest chance of a rescue or a mistake, he wanted to recognize it before anyone else did. The shouting guard finally lowered his arm. I thought I saw movement, he said. Someone near the fence. The entire team tensed even harder. A rescue attempt? A cartel lookout? A journalist who somehow learned about the operation? Or just a trick of the shadows? No one could take the risk. Two guards were sent sprinting toward the fence with flashlights, sweeping the ground, scanning every inch. For 3 long minutes, no one moved. Not El Chapo. Not the U.S. Marshals. Not the Mexican officials. The silence felt endless. Finally, the search team returned. No one's there, one of them said. Just the wind and the shadows. The head officer exhaled slowly, not relief, but urgency. We're moving. Now. No more delays. The team tightened its formation around El Chapo. The U.S. Marshal stepped closer. The aeroplane door opened wider, spilling dim light onto the runway. This was it. El Chapo took one slow step forward. Then another. The guards flanked him, gripping his arms as if the ground itself might try to steal him back. With each step he took toward the aircraft, the reality grew heavier. He wasn't escaping tonight. He wasn't negotiating. He wasn't calling his lawyers. For the first time in decades, his fate was completely out of his control. When he reached the aircraft stairs, he looked up into the dark cabin. It was quiet inside. Cold. Empty except for the marshals waiting to take custody. Behind him, the guards formed a tight protective circle. Ahead of him, the United States awaited. He placed his foot on the first step. And just as he did, a radio crackled to life. A Mexican officer grabbed it instantly, listening closely. His face changed. Something unexpected had happened. Something big enough that it might stop the transfer or force it to speed up even faster. El Chapo paused on the stairs, turning slightly. He knew that look. He knew that tone. For the third time that night, the mission was suddenly dangling on the edge of uncertainty. El Chapo froze on the airplane stairs as the radio crackled. The officer holding it stepped away from the group, listening closely. Cold wind swept across the runway. No one spoke. Finally, the officer returned, his expression tight. Airspace clearance just changed, he said. We have a new window. We need to take off immediately. That was the message. Not an attack. Not a rescue. Not a leak. But something almost as serious for an operation built on secrecy. The flight was suddenly on a very small, very urgent deadline. The Americans reacted first. Move him. Now. The guards tightened their formation around El Chapo. He climbed the remaining steps faster than before, each one echoing like the closing of a chapter he'd spent years trying to avoid. Inside the cabin, the air felt colder. Empty seats lined the walls. U.S. Marshals stood waiting with expressionless faces. They guided him to the first seat on the left, the one closest to the exit, the most secure position on the plane. His handcuffs were checked again. His ankles were secured. The belt snapped into place with a sharp metallic click. For the first time since leaving his cell, El Chapo spoke. "Is this really happening tonight?" A marshal answered without emotion. "It's happening right now." Outside the aircraft, the Mexican officers worked fast. Documents were signed. Custody was transferred. A final confirmation echoed through the radio. Runway clear. Permission granted. The hatch began to close. El Chapo turned his head slightly, looking through the narrow gap as the door lowered. Mexico, the country he ruled from the shadows for decades, was slipping out of view. It hit him all at once. This was the moment he had feared. This was the moment he had fought in court. This was the moment he never believed would actually arrive. The door sealed shut. The engines roared to life. The marshals sat down across from him, watching him without speaking. El Chapo leaned back slowly, breathing through his nose. Controlled, quiet, unreadable. Minutes later, the plane began to move. Rolling, accelerating, racing down the runway. Then it lifted into the darkness, leaving the desert lights behind. Only one thought ran through his mind. Everything he knew, everything he controlled, everything he built, was now thousands of feet below him. And in front of him waited the United States, with courts he couldn't delay, prisons he couldn't escape, and a future he couldn't change. But as the plane climbed higher, a different kind of tension spread through the cabin. One of the marshals received a message on his secure device. He looked up slowly. "El Chapo," he said, his voice steady. "There's something you need to hear." The prisoner raised his eyes. The marshal continued. "We just received a new order, and it concerns you directly." Inside the aircraft, the engines hummed steadily as the marshals settled into their positions. The cabin was bright but cold, built for security, not comfort. El Chapo sat strapped in, staring forward, surrounded on all sides. For a long time, no one spoke. It was the kind of silence that carried weight, the silence of a man leaving his world behind. Then one of the marshals leaned forward. "Mr. Guzmán," he said calmly, "you are now in the custody of the United States." That single sentence marked a turning point. The real one, the legal one, the one that mattered more than the locked door or the aircraft lifting into the air. Another marshal opened a folder and began reading clearly, slowly. "El Chapo, you are being extradited to face charges in the Eastern District of New York." He listed them one by one: conspiracy, drug trafficking, firearms, leadership of a criminal enterprise. It was not dramatic. It was not loud. But it was heavy. The weight of every courtroom waiting for him, every witness prepared to testify, every file stacked against him. This was the moment El Chapo officially heard what awaited him on U.S. soil. The marshal continued. "You have the right to remain silent. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford one." El Chapo cut in quietly. "I understand." His voice was calm, not angry, not afraid, just controlled. The voice of a man who had spent his entire life calculating, adjusting, surviving. But this time, there was nothing to calculate. No tunnel, no bribe, no route back. The marshals returned to their seats. The cabin fell silent again. Outside the windows, there was only darkness. No cities, no lights, no geography he recognized. He pressed his back into the seat and closed his eyes for a moment. For the first time, he wasn't thinking about escape. There was nothing to escape to. He was thinking about what waited for him when the wheels touched down. A supermax prison, a sealed courtroom, a trial that could not be delayed, avoided, or influenced. Hours later, the pilot's voice finally broke the silence. "We are approaching New York. Prepare for landing." El Chapo opened his eyes. He looked at the marshals. He looked down at the restraints on his arms and legs. He wasn't entering a city. He was entering the end of his story. The aircraft descended through the clouds. Lights appeared below. New York, glowing like a world he'd heard of but never imagined he'd face like this. The landing gear dropped. The runway rose into view. As the wheels touched down, the marshals tightened up. This was the moment they had prepared for. This was the moment Mexico had waited for. This was the moment the United States had pushed toward for years. The plane slowed. The doors would soon open, and on the other side waited federal agents, armored vehicles, and a courtroom ready to begin the final chapter of the most famous drug lord of his era. But right before the aircraft door unlocked, something unexpected happened on the ground, something that forced the marshals to move faster than planned. As the aircraft slowed to a stop on the runway at Long Island's MacArthur Airport, the marshals prepared themselves. Their plan was simple: move El Chapo from the plane into an armored vehicle, form a secure convoy, and get him to Brooklyn without delay. But when the cabin door opened, the marshals were met with something they did not expect. Reporters, dozens of them. Camera crews lined up behind the perimeter fence, lenses pointed directly at the aircraft. News vans filled the lot. Helicopters hovered at a distance. The story had leaked, not the details of the operation, but the fact that the United States was receiving El Chapo tonight. No one knew how. No one knew who said what. But the news media had arrived in force, and their presence changed everything. The lead marshal spoke quickly into his radio. "We're adjusting the route. Reroute the convoy immediately. Keep the press back." The ground team responded. "Copy. Security perimeter expanding now." El Chapo watched silently as the marshals reacted with calm urgency. Armored SUVs pulled into a tighter formation. Additional agents moved into position. Flashlights swept the runway edges. This wasn't danger, but it was visibility. And visibility was the last thing anyone wanted during a high-profile prisoner transfer. The marshals moved him fast. They guided him down the aircraft stairs, gripping his arms tightly, making sure the cameras couldn't get a clear view of his face. Flashbulbs exploded from the fence line. Shouts echoed. "El Chapo! El Chapo!" He didn't turn his head. He didn't react. His expression stayed blank, almost empty. Within seconds, they placed him in the center SUV of the convoy, the most protected position. The door slammed shut. Another radio message came through. "Convoy, hold position." Something else was happening. A crowd of people had gathered near the airport road. Not just reporters, but curious onlookers, locals who had heard the news and rushed out to witness history. The marshals had to wait until the perimeter was fully secured, and that took longer than expected. Every minute felt heavy. El Chapo sat still in the back seat, hands cuffed, legs restrained, looking straight ahead. He knew this wouldn't stop the process. He knew it didn't change his fate, but it was the first time he truly saw how large his story had become. How many people were watching? How many cameras were waiting? How many eyes were following his downfall? Finally, the radio crackled again. "Perimeter sealed. Route cleared. Move the convoy." Engines growled to life. The vehicles rolled forward. First slowly, then faster still as they exited the airport and entered the highway. They were heading toward Brooklyn, toward the courthouse where he would be presented before a U.S. judge for the very first time. But halfway across the bridge, as the skyline of New York City began to rise in the distance, traffic came to a sudden, unexpected halt. Red brake lights filled the highway. The convoy slowed sharply, and the lead marshal's voice cut through the radio. "Hold position. Something's blocking the route." The convoy rolled to a stop. Red brake lights stretched across the bridge like a glowing river, unmoving. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't a threat. It was New York City traffic, the kind you can't predict, even at night, even during a secret operation. The marshals didn't panic. They didn't raise their voices. They simply switched into the next phase of protocol. "Traffic units, confirm the cause," one marshal said into the radio. A response came almost instantly. "Construction bottleneck ahead. Lane closure. We're working on clearing a path now." The lead marshal exhaled sharply through his nose. A small thing, but in an operation this sensitive, even small things mattered. Inside the armored SUV, El Chapo sat motionless. No expression, no emotion. Only the hum of the engine and the distant sounds of New York carrying across the bridge. He stared out the darkened window, watching the faint outlines of passing cars and the glow of the city ahead. For a moment, everything felt frozen. A helicopter buzzed somewhere above the skyline, likely a news outlet tracking updates. The marshals didn't look up. They were used to it. Then, the radio crackled again. "Traffic units are pushing through. ETA to movement. 30 seconds. The convoy prepared. Engines idled. Hands tightened on steering wheels. Eyes scanned the sides of the bridge. And finally, "Convoy, you're cleared. Move now." The line of armored vehicles surged forward. The moment they cleared the bottleneck, the pace quickened. Street signs flashed by. The Brooklyn skyline widened. They were getting close. Within minutes, the massive structure of the E.D.N.Y. Federal Courthouse came into view, tall, cold, glowing under the harsh night lights. This was it. This was where the world would see him. The convoy turned sharply into the underground garage, a secured loading area few people ever saw. The giant metal gate slammed shut behind them. The noise echoed. Inside the garage, everything was calm, controlled, and intensely bright. A team of U.S. Marshals was already waiting. Papers were ready. Cameras, the official kind, were set up to document the transfer. Every step of the process had to be recorded. "Open the rear door," the supervisor ordered. Two marshals stepped forward. They pulled the handle. The door swung open. El Chapo slowly stepped out, chains clinking with each movement. This wasn't a dramatic moment for him. Just another step. Another official procedure. But for the marshals, history was walking past them. They guided him toward a small, reinforced hallway, the entrance to the courthouse holding area. And that's when something unexpected happened again. A sudden burst of noise echoed from above the garage. Not shouting, not danger, but the thunderous sound of hundreds of reporters gathering outside the building, crowding the sidewalks, calling his name, flooding the street with camera flashes. The courthouse walls trembled with the noise. One marshal paused. "Looks like the entire press corps showed up." Another muttered, "Yeah, and they're not leaving tonight." For the first time, El Chapo glanced upward, not in fear, but in recognition. He knew that sound. It was the sound of a story too big to hide. The sound of the world watching. A marshal gestured forward. "Let's move. Courtroom is ready." They led him deeper into the building, toward the chamber where he would face a U.S. judge for the first time. But just before they reached the final door, a clerk rushed out, holding a folder. "Stop," she said, breathless. The judge just issued a new instruction. The marshals froze. The hallway froze. The marshals, El Chapo, everyone, all standing still as the clerk held out the folder, catching her breath. Her voice was steady, but urgent. "The judge has ordered an immediate change. He wants the initial hearing moved to a different courtroom." The marshals exchanged quick looks. Not panic, not confusion, just rapid calculation. "Which courtroom?" the supervisor asked. "Courtroom 8D, the clerk replied. "He wants it away from the windows. Too much media outside." That made sense. Outside the courthouse, reporters were still gathering by the hundreds. Camera flashes lit up the entire block. News helicopters hovered above like metallic shadows. The original courtroom faced the street, and that meant photographers could potentially capture images through the blinds. For any other defendant, no one would care. But this wasn't any other defendant. This was Joaquín El Chapo Guzmán. Everything had to be controlled. Everything. "Copy that," the lead marshal said. "Route us to 8D. The clerk nodded and hurried back toward the elevators. Now the marshals adjusted. The entire team repositioned, shifting to a new formation. El Chapo was guided down a quieter hallway, one almost never used except for high-security detainees. The building hummed with fluorescent lights and the faint echo of footsteps. Every door they passed was reinforced with thick metal frames. El Chapo walked calmly, saying nothing, his chains clicking softly with each step. They approached a restricted elevator. Two marshals stepped inside first, checking the corners. All clear. El Chapo was brought in next, flanked tightly on both sides. Another marshal entered last and pressed the button marked 8. The door slid shut. For a moment, the elevator was silent. The hum of machinery, the slow upward motion, the cramped space. No one spoke. El Chapo stared at the metal panel in front of him, his reflection faint, distorted by the brushed steel. When the elevator finally stopped, the doors opened to a quiet, empty hallway lit by soft yellow lights. A sign on the wall read, "Courtroom 8D." The marshals moved again. Down the hall, past offices, past security doors. Then they reached it, the heavy wooden door of Courtroom 8D. Inside, a team of court clerks and officials were already preparing. Papers were stacked, microphones tested, seats adjusted. This hearing would be short, just a formal presentation of charges, but the world was waiting for it. A marshal placed a hand on the courtroom door handle. "You ready?" he asked the supervisor. The supervisor nodded once. "Let's go." But just as the door began to open, a voice called from behind, "Hold on. We need him processed first." Everyone turned. It was another clerk, holding a clipboard filled with forms. "He has to be fingerprinted and photographed before the judge sees him," she said. "The intake room is this way. Court can't begin until it's done." The marshals exchanged another look. A small delay, another procedure, another unexpected turn in a night filled with them. "All right," the supervisor said. "Take us there." They pivoted again, following the clerk toward a narrow hallway leading deeper into the courthouse, toward the official intake room where every federal detainee, no matter how famous, had to go. They stopped outside a steel door. The clerk swiped her access card. A loud buzz. The lock disengaged. The door swung open. The marshals guided El Chapo inside and stopped, because waiting in the room were 6 additional federal agents who hadn't been part of the original escort. Their badges were visible, their expressions serious, their posture firm. The supervisor frowned slightly. "We weren't told about extra personnel." One of the agents stepped forward. "New orders," he said calmly. "We're taking over the intake process." The room fell quiet. The marshals stepped into the intake room first. No unexpected agents. No last-minute surprises. Just a brightly lit space with white walls, a camera tripod, fingerprint scanners, and 2 federal technicians waiting at their stations. This was the room every high-profile detainee passed through, from international traffickers to white-collar criminals. Today, it just happened to be El Chapo. The door shut behind them. A clerk checked her clipboard. "Processing begins now," she said. El Chapo was guided to a small marker on the floor. The camera light clicked on. Face forward. Turn to the left. Turn to the right. Each movement was calm, silent, measured. Nothing dramatic, but the weight of history hung over every second. Cameras outside the courthouse couldn't see this part. Nobody cheering. Nobody shouting. No helicopters buzzing overhead. Just the quiet click of the shutter. Next came fingerprints. The technician motioned him closer. Right hand. Now left. Now both thumbs. The machine beeped after each scan. A digital record capturing the identity of the man who had once been one of the most elusive fugitives on the planet. The clerk checked each scan carefully. "Prints confirmed," she said. "Proceed to paperwork." A small stack of documents was placed on the table: formal charges, rights explanations, intake forms. El Chapo didn't touch them. He wasn't required to. He simply listened as a marshal read them aloud. When it ended, the clerk looked up. "That completes intake. He's cleared for court." The marshals didn't waste a second. They reformed their escort position. 4 in front, 2 at his sides, 2 behind. The door buzzed open. They began walking him toward Courtroom 8D, where the judge was already waiting. The hallways felt tighter now, more serious, more final, because once he stepped inside that courtroom, the world would finally see the moment Mexico had tried to prevent for years: Joaquín Guzmán standing before a U.S. judge. As they approached the courtroom door, the sounds grew louder. Shuffling inside, clerks adjusting papers, lawyers murmuring, security radios crackling. The door opened. Bright lights spilled out. Dozens of officials turned their heads at once. And just as El Chapo was about to be led inside, a court officer rushed forward with a message: "Wait. The judge wants to address the room privately before El Chapo enters. Hold him outside until the signal is given." The marshal stopped instantly. Another delay. Another pause. Another moment where time seemed to freeze. El Chapo stood still, expression unchanged, surrounded by a circle of marshals as the courtroom murmurs continued behind the closed door. What was the judge saying? Why did he need to speak privately first? What instructions were being given? For now, no one in the hallway knew. But the door remained closed, and the world's most watched defendant waited in silence. The hallway stayed silent. El Chapo stood between the marshals, waiting, listening to the muffled voices on the other side of the courtroom door. Then, click, the lock disengaged. A court officer stepped out and gave a simple nod. "Bring him in." The marshals moved at once. The door opened wide, and the entire courtroom shifted their eyes toward the entrance. Every seat was filled. Prosecutors on one side, federal agents lining the walls, court clerks typing rapidly. No reporters inside. This part was closed to the press, but the world was waiting outside. El Chapo was guided to the defense table. He sat down calmly, hands still chained. The judge entered, and the entire room stood. "Be seated," he said. A moment of pure stillness filled the chamber. Then the judge began reading the charges, serious, lengthy, and delivered with absolute clarity. As each charge echoed through the courtroom, El Chapo didn't react. Not a twitch, not a flinch. He simply stared forward. The judge then asked the question every extradition leads to. "How do you plead?" His attorney answered for him. "Not guilty, Your Honor." The courtroom air tightened. It was official. El Chapo had begun his United States legal journey, a journey that would lead to one of the most watched trials in American history. The judge continued with the final formalities. No bail. Maximum security detention. Next court date set. All paperwork to be filed immediately. Then he looked directly at El Chapo and said, "Mr. Guzmán, you are now remanded to the custody of the United States Marshals Service." With those words, everything changed. The marshals moved quickly. They lifted El Chapo from his chair. They resecured his restraints. They positioned themselves around him. The judge exited. The clerk closed her files. The courtroom emptied fast. Outside, the roar of reporters echoed through the concrete walls. Inside, the marshals led El Chapo back down the same long hallway, toward the elevator, toward the waiting vehicle, toward the detention center that would become his new world. And that was the moment it all became real. For years, he had escaped. For years, he had hidden. For years, he had slipped through barriers that seemed impossible. But now, his extradition was complete. His transfer was done. His U.S. trial had officially begun. And the man who once controlled mountains was now controlled by steel doors, silent guards, and a federal system that never sleeps. The secret extradition was over. If you enjoyed this story and want the next chapter of El Chapo's journey, hit that like button, drop a comment with what shocked you most, and smash subscribe so you don't miss the next episode. This is only the beginning, and the next part gets even deeper. See you in the next one.